Good evening, everyone. My name is Kenny LaPlante. I'm the founder of Genial Care, and I'm very excited tonight to be having a conversation with two amazing occupational therapists. Dr. Zoe Mailloux is a founding partner of the Collaborative for Leadership in Ayres Sensory Integration. She has more than 40 years of experience in test development and clinical research related to sensory integrative dysfunction and autism. Zoe was a research assistant to Dr. Jean Ayres from 1978 to 1984. And she also received an award of excellence from the Autism Research Foundation, the Wilma West Lectureship at the University of Southern California, and the A. Jean Ayres Award and the Virginia Scardina Award of Excellence from the American Occupational Therapy Foundation. Zoe, thanks so much for joining us and welcome.
Very happy to be with you. I miss Brazil, so I'm happy to be back virtually.
And we can't wait to host you here in person next time. And Madi, also really pleased to have you here with us tonight. Mariana has over 15 years of experience in the field of OT and in autism. She has a certification in higher education from Harvard University, an international certification in sensory integration from USC, and has postgraduate degrees in physical rehabilitation and business management. Madi, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
And I'm Kenny LaPlante. I'm the founder of Genial Care. Genial Care is an atypical health network, and our mission is to ensure that all children reach their full potential, starting with children with autism and starting in Brazil. But most importantly, for tonight, I am your host, and I'm very excited for this conversation with Zoe and Mariana, and we'll be talking about a number of occupational therapy-related themes. We're going to hear about the Esse. We're going to talk about the importance of assessment and setting intervention goals. Everyone who's listening, I know you're very excited to hear from Zoe and from Madi this evening. But first, I wanted to get started with a little bit more of a simple, high-level question for Zoe. So Zoe, in 2020, as you know, Ayres sensory integration officially became an evidence-based practice for ASD through the official report of the National Clearinghouse on Autism Evidence and Practice. As someone who worked directly with Dr. Jean Ayres, I can imagine that felt like a long time coming. Can you tell us a little bit about the significance of that and for the field of ASI?
Yes, absolutely. And thank you for taking notice of that. You know, hearing that question made me think about the years of preparation that came before that occurrence. And Dr. Ayres, when she was developing sensory integration theory, she was very dedicated to scholarship. She conducted intervention studies early on that showed very positive results of this intervention. But then over the years, there were many, many studies of sensory integration that were published that, for those of us who understood the work of Dr. Ayres, we could barely recognize what these studies were talking about. They were using techniques that had nothing to do with Dr. Ayres' ideas. So for many years, there were publications that showed lack of effectiveness of this approach, which wasn't surprising because the outcome measures were misplaced. The techniques being used were something else. They didn't make sense. So there was a great deal of effort over a decade or so to prepare for logical, methodical, scholarly research to occur. And that included developing a fidelity measure that demonstrated what Ayres sensory integration was and was not, naming this approach as Ayres sensory integration to differentiate it from sensory whatever, some other sensory stimulation approaches that were being used, and identifying the appropriate outcome measures, because we don't expect this approach to improve all areas of human activity. There's specific areas that are focused upon in this approach. So when those efforts were put into place, then it opened the door for solid scholarly research, intervention studies, randomized control trial studies around this approach. I know Dr. Ayres would have been so pleased to see this because she knew that she had ideas that were really life-changing for so many people, that she understood problems that no one else was talking about, and that she had solutions to the problem. She knew that she was helping people, but the negative studies and the criticisms were very hard for her to cope with. So I just know that she would be so pleased to see this acknowledgement of the work, not for herself or her own name. She would never have named this approach Ayres sensory integration, but we needed to do that to make it clear what we were talking about.
Yeah, and I hear in your response, Zoe, kind of the importance of not using a one size fits all approach. As you say, it was very important to distinguish Ayres sensory integration from other approaches, and also understand that it's not going to solve all things for all people, being very precise in that understanding. I think that's a good kind of segue to bring Madi into the conversation. Madi, we at Genial Care we're not just occupational therapy, we're multidisciplinary.
Mhm.
And we use evidence-based practices at Genial Care, and a number of different evidence-based practices, not just one. If you could share a little bit with Zoe and with the audience how we approach evidence-based practices at Genial Care, I think that'd be great context.
Sure, Kenny. Well, here at Genial Care, we use 16 EBPs in the intervention, and Ayres sensory integration is one of the 16 EBPs. And we have this defined in our clinical base model here at Genial Care. And all these EBPs, we have fidelity checklists for all of them to support implementation in practice. And in case of Ayres sensory integration, we use the fidelity measure. Here in Brazil, Ayres sensory integration is just for occupational therapists for now. But the others, 15 EBPs, we can use in a multidisciplinary.
Yeah, that multidisciplinary approach is really central to what we do at Genial Care. And Zoe, just to maybe piggyback on what Madi said, we have 3 different types of professionals, all of whom are certified and all of whom are trained at Genial Care Academy, whether they're psychologists, speech language pathologists, or OTs. They all come to Genial with some prior certification, but they also get trained in that multidisciplinary approach, regardless of the discipline that they're in. So if you're an OT, you're getting some fundamentals in speech language, for example. If you're a speech language pathologist, you're getting some fundamentals in psychology and OT, for example. And that's all thinking about, trying to advance this multidisciplinary approach and applying these EBPs. And I think I speak for all of us at Genial Care and all of our therapists that we stand on the shoulders of giants, to use a turn of phrase here, because none of this would be possible if we didn't have the scholarship and the well-grounded research from people like you, Zoe, people like Dr. Jean Ayres as well. And so we're able to try to find ways of applying that in the real world here in Brazil. I wanted to shift gears slightly, Zoe, now and talk a little bit about some of the protocols that you've been involved in and are developing. And I know you're really excited to talk about the EASI. I know everyone's very excited to hear from you about the EASI. So, Zoe, you had told me a story offline, kind of behind the scenes of how the EASI came to be, where you tell us a little bit kind of where you were in the world, what was the context, how did the EASI come to be?
Sure, and this actually does go back to the previous topic, because part of the fidelity measure that was under development from maybe around 2004 to around 2014, over that 10-year period. Part of the fidelity measure mandates that a comprehensive assessment is provided to children or to whoever, to the patient, prior to implementing an approach using Ayres sensory integration. So that's part of the definition of this approach, that there must be a comprehensive assessment in place before you try to provide treatment, which to me seems like such common sense. It was very important to Dr. Ayres. She never would have tried to treat children based on an observation or a checklist. She always had very strong assessment tools. And so in the process, we were developing the fidelity measure. We knew that was an important component. And we were actually at an international meeting in Finland. It was in June, during the time of year in Finland where there's light 24 hours a day. And the World Cup happened to be going on at the time. And it was an international meeting. So the World Cup, you know, creates a lot of excitement internationally for everyone from their country teams. And we were in, you know, in a bar having a nice time watching the game and, you know, kind of in that loose atmosphere, chatting about professional issues at the same time. I think that's how we get a lot done, is that we combine our work with fun. And we started talking about the frustration of some of these negative studies. This was in 2014, so it was prior to Ayres-SI being identified as an evidence-based practice. And there was still some of this negativity going on. And we started thinking about, well, what could we do? What could we do as a group? We have a lot of talent and expertise in this group of international colleagues. And we decided during this bar time watching the game that it would be a great idea if we set some goals to commemorate Dr. Ayres' 100th birthday. She would have turned 100 years old in the year 2020. And we thought, well, let's celebrate her 100th birthday. 2020, so far away from 2014. We have 6 years. And we set 3 goals. One was to advance scholarship by identifying published journal articles that contributed to the evolution of Ayres sensory integration theory. Another goal was to develop international standards for training so that therapists could be mobile and go from one country to the other and have their credentials recognized, but even more importantly for families who might be moving from one place to another, that they could be ensured that whatever intervention their child was getting around sensory integration could be replicated in another setting. So those were 2 goals. And the third goal was that we would have accessible assessment for children worldwide. At the time, before Dr. Ayres passed away, her last effort was to develop a set of tests called the Sensory Integration and Praxis Test, which were just an excellent and have been an excellent set of tests. However, the normative data for those tests was collected in 1984 to 1989. The tests were published in 1989. So it was quite old, the norms, and normative data was only from the United States, and they were exceptionally expensive tests to use. So we knew from our experience that they were not being used regularly worldwide, that many therapists around the world could not afford the cost to provide that assessment on a regular basis. So that led to our idea of, well, you know, we'll just make our own tests. We'll make our own tests and we will keep them outside of a for-profit model. We'll make sure that we have international normative data. And by the way, Dr. Ayres would be 100, so let's aim for 100 countries. And we, you know, had these lofty thoughts. No problem. We know people in more than 100 countries. We know what occupational therapists are like in their heart. We think that if we ask them to help us to collect normative data, they will. And we launched, probably a little bit naive, you know, being in a bar watching the World Cup, but it seemed like a good idea at the time. And we launched, and it had so much power and enthusiasm that it became a real initiative by the next morning. By the next morning, it was a buzz at the conference. Everyone was talking about these new tests. And we realized, oh my goodness, we actually have to do this. So we did. The three authors, it's myself, Dr. Suzanne Smith-Rowley, and Dr. Diane Parham. We decided early on that the three of us would be authors because the three of us worked with Dr. Ayres while she was developing the SIPT. And we felt like that we had as best a chance as anyone to put our heads together and to imagine what Dr. Ayres might have done, now if she were still with us, to update the assessment and to fill in gaps and to make the test easier and definitely more cost effective. So we've done it. Of course, we didn't expect a pandemic in the year 2020, so that was a bit of a glitch. We didn't get to finish by 2020, and we lost some of the countries that were participating. But we did end up with over 80 countries. So we have normative data from more than 80 countries. We developed 20 tests, and we have a scoring program. They're in use now. Already thousands of therapists around the world have been trained in using these tests and are using them on a regular basis to provide comprehensive assessment. And they're very affordable. After the training, there's almost no cost involved. The materials are purchased from everyday places, so there's no intellectual property kind of excessive cost attached to them.
I love that story, and I love the vision that you all had and the spontaneity, right? Being around a bar among friends and colleagues watching the World Cup. I think all the Brazilians watching this can definitely relate, but relate to that. The World Cup is taken very seriously here for sure, as you know. And I think for anyone who didn't notice, Zoe's got a Portuguese gratitude message hanging up behind her. So Zoe's certainly no stranger to Brazil. Zoe, I'd love if you could just elaborate a little bit on, I think in your prior answer, you spoke to the importance of access. And it sounded like you were, when you all were developing the EASI, you were building off of what had already been done in the SIPT. And it sounds like you and your two co-founders had been involved in the development of the SIPT and had very deep knowledge of that. Tell us a little bit, compare and contrast the SIPT versus the EASI, and why did you decide to build it in that purposeful way? Why is it different?
Yeah, so to start out with why it's the same, the SIPT, Dr. Ayres was such a methodical, systematic, careful thinker. And when she developed the sensory integration and praxis test, part of the reason those tests are named the way they are was due to the increase in the diagnosis of autism beginning in the 1980s. Dr. Ayres always developed tests. She started in the 1950s, 1960s, and had an early set of tests that she published in the 1970s called the Southern California Sensory Integration Test. In her practice in the 1980s, the diagnosis of autism was increasing suddenly, and we know what happened, that the numbers went up rapidly. And she started to see many more challenges in praxis or motor planning. So when she decided to take on a revision of the Southern California test that she had put together, she wanted to emphasize praxis because she could see that so many people with autism were struggling with praxis. And that's why she named those tests the way she did, the sensory integration and praxis test, to highlight that increase in those tests. And so they were really helpful and powerful tests, and we wanted to mirror the SIPT as much as we could. Our goals with the EASI were to hopefully accomplish everything that the SIPT had accomplished, to fill in some of the gaps. So we added some tests that we, in our best effort, we thought might be areas that Dr. Ayres would add if she were around. That included a test of ideation, which again is something very significant for the diagnosis of autism, being able to come up with an idea of what's possible to do with your hands or with some objects. We added a test of oral tactile perception because so many of the children that we see have difficulty with feeding or articulation. We do train speech and language pathologists in our programs overall. In Brazil, the training's been limited to occupational therapists for some professional reasons, but internationally, we do train physical therapists, speech and language pathologists, and psychologists in the testing. And many speech and language therapists have been concerned about articulation, the ability to plan actions with the face and mouth. So we added a test of tactile perception orally and an auditory localization test. We also added some direct measures of sensory reactivity. There's been a lot of emphasis on over and under reactivity to sensation. Unfortunately, most of that assessment has been only by either observation or questionnaire. And the observations and questionnaires are great, but they were really meant to be supplements to direct performance-based testing. So we now have some direct scores from the actual performance of the child around sensory reactivity. So that was our goal in terms of the gaps. We also making sure the tests were accessible, that therapists around the world could use them was our main goal. We were really concerned about therapists who might work in favelas or townships or, small communities where they might not have access or especially the financial resources to pay these large fees that were necessary to use the SIFT. So that was an important goal. It required a lot of volunteer hours. We had everyone who worked on the EASI was a volunteer, the authors, the coordinators, all of the testers who collected normative data did so on a volunteer basis. I mean, really, I can't even imagine what the price tag would be for this project if it had to be funded. But there's a lot of generosity of spirit in this community, and people really gave of their time to make sure it could happen.
Yeah, it's amazing. And I could hear the passion you have about this topic in your voice. So I'm sure that is shared by the rest of the people involved. It's been 10 years since this famous or perhaps infamous night at the bar. What do you expect for the next 10 years, next 20 years?
Well, what I am so excited about is the potential for research. The way that the EASI is structured as an assessment tool and possibly as an outcome measure, we don't know yet, but we hope that at least some of these 20 tests will be good measures for identifying change after intervention. And so with the way we have the scoring program set up and basically the free access to the materials and the scoring once training has taken place, we expect to just have an explosion of research. The opportunities for people in graduate programs or researchers who want to study this area, we feel that we've really removed a major obstacle because the assessment piece is so important, but if it was so expensive and with old normative data and cumbersome tests, then that was a difficult obstacle to get past. So we feel that we've removed that obstacle now with the EASI, and we expect to have much more research. And, as you said, we know sensory integration is not the only approach needed. It's one of many, but when it's effective, it's very effective, and we want to see it done. We want to see it applied appropriately and in a professional way and in an accurate way. So we think that we have the tools for that now.
Yeah, it's wonderful. Madi, you're familiar with the EASI as well. You've used the SIPT for quite a long time. Would love to hear your perspective on this, particularly your experience in Brazil. How do you see the EASI being applied to the ASD population in Brazil? And if you can, how do you see the EASI potentially relating to what we do at Genial in our clinical model?
Perfect. EASI is a direct assessment protocol and requires children to respond to instructions. So for this group of kids, children, for sure, we should use Easy here in Brazil. And when thinking about Genial Care, here at Genial Care, we have the clinical-based model. Clinical-based model is our quality guide here. And in this guide, we explain the initial assessment here at Genial Care. And our initial assessment, we looked at major domains for child development. So including communication, socialization, daily activities, motor skills. And this data help us to choose therapeutic targets. And it's important to say that our therapeutic targets, they are always related with function and real life. So thinking that Easy support us to understand sensory dysfunction. And sensory dysfunction is really usual to find in our population, in autism population. So I see that if we can relate the sensory dysfunction with the functional therapeutic targets, I see a really potential to help this kid much more because if we don't see this relation between the sensory dysfunction with the real life, we can choose maybe the not the best practice. I see a big potential for Genial Care to use Easy as an official assessment because it really can help us to make this relation and to be more assertive with the intervention.
I think, Mariana, you're making such a great point about daily life and therapeutic targets in relation to occupation, as occupational therapists understand occupation, the things that are meaningful to all of us in our daily life. And, you know, the fact that Dr. Ayres was an occupational therapist, I think, shines through. Sometimes there's a misunderstanding that in sensory integration, we're only focused on these very narrow sensory motor functions. But truly, we understand that the basis for everything we do in life is dependent on these foundational abilities. So it's not that we are just focused on sensory or motor abilities. We care about the building blocks to being able to take care of ourselves, to do the things in life that we all want to do and that are meaningful. And that's such an important point that you made. I'm glad that you talked about that.
Well, Zoe, I would love, we received dozens of questions actually from therapists in our network, some of whom are occupational therapists, some of whom are not occupational therapists. And I was hoping to give you a chance to respond to just a couple of them. We tried to filter some of them here. And so my first one here for you, Zoe, if you could. So in a more complex case with a lot of coexisting sensory dysfunction patterns, how do you recommend selecting the initial intervention priorities?
Yes, I love this question. And whenever I'm teaching, which is, you know, quite often, my first comment almost to the group is how many of you, as you were hearing about these tests, thought, okay, this is nice, but never in a million years will I be able to use these tests with the children that I see. It's a very common, I think, somewhat misconception that we can't use assessments with all individuals. So with the EASI is developed for children age 3 up to age 12 years, 11 months, which we do think it probably will have application beyond that. But at when we developed the test, we tried to develop them as free from language, from cognitive ability, and from the necessity of experience as possible. So if you think about testing a 3-year-old, you can imagine that you would need to use very little language. You could not depend on very high-level cognitive functions. And we believe that when professionals go through the training and go through the process to really understand these functions, they will be able to gather data, either through the direct testing and actual scores that they might find hard to believe they will be able to get a score, or other ways of observing for these functions once they have really understood them more fully through the training process. So, for example, if I'm going to test an 18-month-old, I'm not going to use the EASI directly, but I might use items from many of the tests and observe how the child does and get an idea about relative areas of strength versus areas that maybe seem to be a little more problematic. But I do that based on now many years of experience, knowing the tests and the scores with many children who are able to participate with the test. So I think one hurdle we still have is helping professionals understand that they can do a complete assessment, even if they're not able to get scores in the same manner, or if they can't get all of the scores. But I still want to know about the full array of not only sensory integration functions, but as Mariana was saying, we want to know the full picture, what's going on socially, medically, psychologically, emotionally. We need to have the whole picture and consider all the data in order to put together the best plan.
Yeah, it makes a ton of sense, and I've heard Mariana say this many times. I've heard many of our other clinicians say this many times, that any evaluation, it's just a photo of the child, and so the more data you can bring in and the more perspective you can bring in, certainly creates a more fuller picture, and will help you plan those priorities more effectively.
Certainly, the more that the professional understands the functions and can share that with the family and teachers and other people who are spending a lot of time with, let's say, children or with the individuals, then those caregivers, those stakeholders can also help us to fill in the gaps when they understand, when we do our job well and can help them to really understand what we're looking at.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a good segue for the next question here. So we had a therapist ask, what recommendations do you have for bringing the stimuli provided in the SI room into the individual's daily life, whether they're a child or an adult?
Well, I guess I'd start by saying I kind of like to avoid the term stimuli. We look for meaningful, purposeful experiences for the individual. I think the main thing is really making sure that we spend time understanding strengths and interests. In the sensory integration approach, we have a little bit different perspective on some behaviors that are sometimes classified as self-stimulatory or non-purposeful. I think from our heart in occupational therapy, we try to respect each person where they are and try to come from their perspective and an understanding of why certain behaviors might be present. And rather than have a view that there are some behaviors that are negative and must be extinguished, we might say, well, what does this particular action or behavior do for the person? How could we maybe mold it or build on it to help this individual participate more fully? So that's a long way around saying that, I think we use that same principle in then bringing therapeutic activities into homes, schools, and other settings. It's really so much about understanding the individual and why they either enjoy or gravitate towards something, or on the other hand, why they're avoiding activities that maybe are important for them to participate in. And the more we have that understanding, then we can start coming up with solutions, whether it's in a therapy setting or at home or school or wherever, the individual is.
Bonus for my own curiosity, Zoe. My understanding is that the EASI is designed for the sensory integration room setting, but have there been experiments, or have there been applications, or has it been applied in the home environment, in the natural environment, in other settings?
So the EASI is this assessment tool that we would use to understand the child. Then Ayres sensory integration is an approach, is an intervention approach. In its most classic form, it's been provided in a specialized therapy room. And of course, when we've conducted research to look at effectiveness, we want to be able to study this approach in that manner. But of course, we think that there's many applications to home, to school, to community settings. And again, it comes back to the individual, understanding what that individual needs, how we might make either adaptations at home and school to help scaffold for the areas of challenge, or to help the individual work on those areas that need to be further developed. I think that's a general principle in occupational therapy. We go towards adaptation and compensation when we don't think we're going to be able to make additional changes, or sometimes we do both at the same time. But with children, we're really expecting many changes to be possible in a malleable nervous system. So we're less likely to go straight to adaptations and compensation with children than we might be with older individuals.
Makes sense. And, you know, at Genial, we work primarily with children up to age 8. And so it's primarily early intervention in that window of high neuroplasticity, for sure.
To build on neuroplasticity, you need to know what to work on. We see so many cases, sadly, sometimes where, you know, children are practicing or being drilled in areas where they don't need that exercise. You know, it's not a problem area for them. And sometimes they're just, therapy programs get stuck on working on certain things, whether they're applicable to that child or not. And that's what we want to avoid.
Yeah. Yeah, it needs to be customized for each kid and be adaptive as well, right?
Right.
One last question here. Someone, I think, was curious about potentially adapting the physical environment. So one person asked, if you had to choose only 5 pieces of equipment for your room, what would they be?
Well, I guess it would depend on the children coming to see me, but in general, I know that, you know, the basic sensory, the foundational sensory systems are often so necessary to support. So I would definitely want some hooks that allowed me to put up a variety of kinds of swings. It would probably be challenging for me to practice without swings that moved in a variety of planes of motion, because I know how critical the vestibular system is for so many of the later developing foundational functions. How our eyes and head move together, how our ability to hold ourselves up against gravity functions, our balance, our ability to coordinate both sides of our body, all of those things that we use for tying shoes and pedaling a bicycle, or, you know, looking up at a blackboard and back down at our desk, are also vestibular dependent. So I definitely would want swings. And I would want equipment that provided a wide variety of tactile challenges to the tactile perceptual system. Sometimes people only think about reactivity to touch, you know, children being overreactive, but we need and use our tactile discrimination so continually through our day. There's hardly anything that we do that we're not using automatic feedback from touch, whether it's holding a writing utensil, a drinking glass. As we use our phones and computers, we are successful in our daily activities because we can rely on tactile discrimination. So I would want tactile activities that provided an opportunity to look at differentiating different types of tactile input. Proprioception, our position sense, is another one of the kind of 3 foundational sensory systems. So I would want some equipment that allowed jumping, push-pull, hanging, maybe a trapeze, probably a trapeze, some kind of a lycra swing, maybe an inner tube tire, if we think about the very versatile pieces of equipment. But I would encourage therapists to think about the functions that they want to develop, and then depending on their population, the age, variations, the interest of the children or people they're working with, to think about how could they incorporate those sensory experiences and challenges for those individuals. It might be at a home, it might be at school. In California, we're fortunate that we have nice weather most of the year. I think you have that in some parts of Brazil. We often use the playground equipment as a way to hang therapy equipment that we would normally put in a therapy room. We can hang on a swing set or a climbing structure.
Fantastic. That's super, super useful advice, I think, for anyone who's thinking about or has a room and sometimes has to make decisions about what equipment to use, because I think a lot of occupational therapists in Brazil have that type of situation. Zoe, we're going to be wrapping up here now. I wanted to give you just one chance to say or add anything that I didn't ask about. If you could just share a message of closure to all the OTs and other professionals listening right now.
Yes. Well, first, I would just want to say thank you to you and your group for caring so much about children and services, children with autism and all children. The needs are so great. If you're a therapist interested in sensory integration, then I would really encourage you to be patient with yourself in taking the time to really understand these functions and this work that Dr. has left us, because she was really just a once-in-a-lifetime kind of mind, who could see things, and her ideas were so powerful if they're used appropriately. I think Brazil has been fortunate that the interest in this work has occurred at a time where there has not been a lot of negativity in the past. You're coming into a time of awareness of sensory integration in a time of strength. You have Dr. Claudio Mari in your country, who has replicated one of the key randomized controlled trial studies showing the effectiveness. You have a lot of strong leadership. So find a mentor, take the work seriously. Don't think that you're going to understand everything overnight, because it's complex information. The children have complex nervous systems and lives, and just be patient, but trust the data. Make sure that you consume the literature and do your work in terms of gathering assessment data, and then trust that information to build your knowledge base.
Terrific. Well, with that, everyone, we'll wrap up here. Thank you, everyone, for watching, for listening. Zoe, Madi, it was a pleasure, and it was a class for me. So thank you very much.
Obrigada.